I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners across the country where the program's broadcast, particularly the local traditional owners, Jagera, Yagara and Turrbal peoples, the Yugambeh and Malanjali, Kombumerri peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge elders, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders and non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders. Welcome to Let's Talk. It's great to have your company. And now my two guests are here joining us online. I have Duane Hamacher, a PhD candidate, talking to me from Sydney. Duane, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Great.
Duane, tell us a little about yourself, your background, where you're from, where you grew up.
Sure. I'm actually from America. I grew up in a rural town in mid-Missouri, and I went to university at the University of Missouri in Columbia and studied physics and astronomy. And I'd always had a really keen interest in Australia the whole time I grew up. And I moved down here to Sydney in 2006 and did a master's degree in astronomy at the University of New South Wales, and then came over here to Macquarie in 2008 to study Aboriginal astronomy.
All right. And how do you study Aboriginal astronomy? I mean, what is there to deliver to you as part of the course or part of your studies? What documentation is there on Aboriginal astronomy?
There's not a whole lot that has been done. I mean, there's definitely some out there. There's been some papers put out since the mid-1800s. But largely it's a field that hasn't been explored very much, but there certainly seems to be a tremendous amount of evidence that, of course, as most of your viewers would know, that astronomy was a prominent part of Aboriginal culture for tens of thousands of years. So I'm trying to look more into that and bring that out to the mainstream society so it can be a bit more well understood.
And certainly a big need for it. It could have a lot to offer.
Yeah, I certainly hope it does have a lot to offer. So I'm just trying to find specific areas to look at right now, and putting a lot of papers out and trying to get the word out.
Very good, very good. Well, maybe we'll be talking some more in the future. But it's certainly good to have you join us on here this morning for discussion.
Fantastic. Now
I'll just introduce Chris Kavelin. Chris, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Tiger. How are you?
Very well, very well. Now, you are a lecturer and researcher at a couple of different universities.
Yep, that's correct.
Macquarie Uni is one. Where else are you involved?
I'm also associated with ANU and doing some work in Waikato in New Zealand.
Okay. Where'd you grow up? What sort of background you got?
I was born in Manhattan, New York City, and my father was a psychologist that specialized in Indigenous psychology, and I grew up living on different Native American reservations until my late teens, and then I came to Australia and New Zealand and been in Australia since about 1990. And that's a bit of the personal background, but I've always known that there's a lot of healing and medicine from Indigenous communities that's been used by Western culture, and when I found out that the Australian government was trying to systematically take that medicine to be able to develop into more medicines, I started trying to develop my own knowledge about how to protect that, and that's where my research has gone, is trying to honor Indigenous healers and find ways to protect medicine from Aboriginal people so they can control and use it themselves and be respected and honored for that.
All right. So pretty interesting area for studies. And again, is there much in the way of documentation? I was just talking to Duane there, and he's saying, there's not a lot documented in regards to Indigenous astronomy and studies of in that area.
Well, it's interesting that I was doing my master's at the University of Sydney on the environmental crisis. I was actually looking at how nature has a spiritual value and trying to talk about that. And when I found out that 77% of all plant-related medicines or pharmaceuticals come from Indigenous people, and that's about 25% of the world's pharmaceutical market, I found out that that's actually a conservative estimate, and there's lots of documentation to support that. But the problem is that it's scattered around, and it's not something that's in the public eye. We don't learn about it in school, and the government doesn't shout it from the rooftops, and the pharmaceutical companies sure aren't interested in letting us know that their medicines come from Aboriginal communities. So it's a case of there being lots of documentation, but lots of silence. So that's the situation with this area.
All right. Now, we want to talk a little about, I suppose, within the framework of the national education reform in this country, there's been some discussion about how appropriate it is to have Indigenous astronomy, I suppose, included in science, for example, in the subject of science. You've got some views on this? Chris, I can't...
Oh, sorry. About astronomy?
The national reform, or education reform, and the way the government doesn't particularly want to incorporate Indigenous studies in science and stuff, or astronomy.
I think this was an article in the Australian about the Dreamtime, the minister who's in charge of the national science curricula. Saw an article in the earlier paper that the Dreamtime was part of the national science curricula, and he said that he was surprised by that, and he wanted to remove it because he felt it was spiritual or religious, and the Dreamtime doesn't have any scientific content. And basically, when I read that, and others read that, I think there was quite a sense of disappointment with lack of understanding of how sophisticated Indigenous knowledge is in the concept of the Dreamtime, and that there's certainly spiritual is the foundation of the Dreamtime, but that includes very advanced knowledge that involves scientific knowledge that Western people use in their everyday life but don't acknowledge. So to hear that they're planning on taking the Dreamtime out of the national science curricula is quite disappointing, and I'm hoping to be able to, share some information and knowledge about how valuable Indigenous scientific knowledge is to all of us, so that the minister can appreciate that and not make such an uninformed decision.
So do you plan to establish some dialogue or some communication with the minister regarding this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've written a counter article and submitted that to the Australian, and starting just discussions on blogs and trying to send emails to the different people involved in that, and hopefully it'll be just a case that he really just didn't understand and is making an uninformed decision rather than this being something else.
Let's hope that's the case. Can you give us any specific examples of Dreamtime or Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander beliefs or practices of the solar system or astronomy, where it might be useful or beneficial to within the mainstream? I mean, there's seasons, there's different practices amongst our mob where you can look up in the sky and see different shapes, like the emu, for example, when he's in a different position, head down, they're nesting. That's just one example. There's a range of things. I'm just wondering, have you come across any of this sort of stuff in your studies?
That'll be for Duane.
What was that, sorry?
It'll be for Duane, eh?
That'd be for Duane? All right.
Yes. Yeah, mine's the medicine, his is the astronomy.
Okay, sorry, yes, I'm getting a little bit mixed up with you two blokes on here. One's medicine and one's astronomy. Well, with the medicine side of things, what have you, what have you got there as an example?
Side of things, most of our cancer drugs, most of our AIDS drugs come from Indigenous communities, but there's literally hundreds of examples. But what happened was that when Australia, New Zealand, the States, places like that have Indigenous people and were colonized, the colonists from England, they come over with their own medicines, but those medicines, they're not the right medicines for the unique poisons and diseases of Australia. So when they get here, they also run out of their own medicines, and Aboriginal communities are quite happy to share because medicine's for healing. And so it didn't take too long until the first pharmacopoeia, or list of official medicines, became more than half Indigenous. But then the multinationals come in and they change the names of the medicines. But I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the more famous and dramatic ones is Duboisia, sometimes called the corkwood, or the eye-opening plant. But that plant was used a number of ways. But one of the ones is that it helps with seasickness, nausea. So the Normandy invasion, where you got tens of thousands of troops going across the channel, they all had taken extracts from this Aboriginal plant in order to avoid seasickness. And 900 tons of it were being produced every year in the 70s. It was a commercialized plant and being exported to Europe, and it still is an industry in Queensland. And that's based on Aboriginal people having shown colonists its uses. And every major university in Australia at the moment is doing research to find medicines, and has found medicines that they're being developed. National Cancer Institute of the United States is working in collaboration with some of them. But it's a big story. It's quite a lot of the medicine that we have. If you imagine walking into the pharmacy, at least, and there's 4 walls, at least one of those walls comes from Indigenous communities. So it's a pretty big secret that needs to be discussed and honored.
And when you say Indigenous, that's across the country, across the world, universal, Indigenous people across the world.
Yeah, across the world, that's right. Yeah. Same story in every country. Yeah.
When you talk about cork wood, is it the leaf, the cork leaf that's used for this?
Different parts of the plant are used for different, treating different types of things. Like they use the leaves, and they can dilate the eyes for eye operations.
Okay.
And but yeah, there's so it depends. Like you can soak it in water, and it'll come out that way through fusion. But, yeah.
When I was a young fellow down in northern New South Wales, there was some seasonal work where the older men would go out and cut cork leaf, and I never ever followed that up to see what was its uses and things like that. I just wonder, is there a link between this? Is that the same tree? I wonder, whether it's this corkwood that you're talking about and this cork leaf that these old men used to cut.
Yeah, well, there's a good chance of that. Yeah, one of the things is that they kind of change the name so that you don't know what you're using it for. So by the time the pharmaceutical companies turn it into a pill, it's got some marketing name, and nobody's the wiser for it. So, for me, a lot of this started with me asking myself, how am I blind? How am I ignorant about my use of medicines? Why am I not asking questions about where my medicine comes from? And I just started tracing the medicines from the company back to the bush, finding out that some of the medicines I was taking were actually from Indigenous people, that my grandmother, whose life was saved by, a cancer drug, Taxol, that actually came from a yew tree, and it was a Native American community that had given the company that knowledge, but nobody knew about it.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes, no, there's an amazing amount of knowledge out there, and trickery going on in regards to accessing these Indigenous plants and things. The trickery by the pharmaceutical companies, of course. And my guests this morning are Duane Hamacher and Chris Kavelin. Duane is the astronomy. Is a PhD candidate studying astronomy. Duane, we got you there?
Yes.
Very good. Now, tell me your the reason we've got you on here and Chris. We're talking in reference to the restructure of the national education system and the lack of valuing Aboriginal dream time and practices, and not including it in the science, in the subject of science. And you think there's some value in, you think that there's a bit of a loss there, or it's a bit sad? What are your thoughts?
Well, I do think it's very sad. I think that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that's being ignored and sort of swept under the carpet right now. Like Chris said, I'm not sure if it's intentional or just a case of ignorance about the Aboriginal cultures themselves and the knowledge systems. But there's a tremendous amount of knowledge out there, and what I'm looking at is the stuff relating to the sky. For example, back in the 80s and before that, you had well-established, well-respected anthropologists who said categorically that there was no Aboriginal language that had a word for a number higher than 4. And last year at an astronomy conference in Melbourne, Ray Norris gave a talk on Aboriginal astronomy, and he said that to the crowd and asked everybody to raise their hands who had been taught that in school. And between a third and half of the people in attendance raised their hands. They'd been taught this in school. Now, that's horrible, because that tells the non-Indigenous people who probably don't know any better that, Aboriginal people didn't count. They didn't have number systems. They didn't measure things. And, of course, that's complete rubbish. There's very well-documented number systems, and there's plenty of examples in Aboriginal astronomy itself that would, show that that's not true. For example, the Yolngu people in Arnhem Land have an evening star ceremony, and it takes place at a certain location. You look out over the near an island, a sacred island, and just before dawn, Venus rises. Now, Venus rises just before dawn, only a few times out of the year, and it's never the same time. So you have to understand the complex motions of Venus to be able to plan for this. And, of course, the ceremony is planned well in advance. It's not something that just happens sporadically, and several communities from quite some distance come to this. So you have to know how to measure the motion of Venus over time, and how to count the days and things. And, of course, if you can't count past 4, that's a problem. But, of course, you can. There's tons of evidence supporting the idea that the number systems are much more complex than were previously acknowledged. And it turns out that the anthropologists who were looking at those number systems didn't realize that those were number systems based on 5. Western number systems are based on 10. We count the 10, and then we count 10 again, and 10 again. So if you look at Spanish, it's 15, 16 means 10 and 4, 10 and 5. Our number system's based on 10, whereas, there were several Aboriginal groups who had their number systems based on 5. So it was simply not understanding that and then perpetuating this myth that Aboriginal people weren't able to count or didn't measure things. So I think it serves to help close the gap in that respect, and to help people understand that it is a lot more complex than they think.
So, do you think then that that there is quite a lack of value or recognition and understanding of just the knowledge system of our people in this country and across the universe?
From what I've seen, I would say so, but I acknowledge I don't know that much about secondary education in this country. Obviously, I'm from the States, and I've only been here for a few years, so I don't claim to have any expertise in that. Now, I know as far as Aboriginal astronomy is concerned, and I say Aboriginal because we're trying to get somebody else to study Torres Strait Islander astronomy separately. I'm only looking at mainland Australia. That there's not very much known about that, and the research that we're doing, will help contribute to that knowledge and hopefully be incorporated into the national curriculum or into schools. I know there's been a lot of interest expressed, but in the case of dismissing the dream time or anything relating to the dream time, which of course itself is extremely complex and varies significantly between communities. Some communities don't even recognize the dream time. Some don't even like the term dream time or dreaming. So it's important that the teachers and the school districts understand this, and then we can help incorporate this knowledge. I understand one concern in the science classes. They don't want spiritual aspects taught, because in Western society we've separated the spiritual religious realm from what we consider the scientific realm, as everybody already knows. And there are a lot of people trying to fight to put in things like creationism and intelligent design into schools. And the thing is that creationism and intelligent design don't contribute anything scientific to the debate whatsoever. all they attempt to do is find what they perceive to be a gap in the scientific record and then drive a wedge in and say, that's God. However, the indigenous systems do have a lot of information that could be considered scientific, that could be put into a science class, that would certainly help people understand how science and culture relate, without putting, of course, spiritualism and the natural world were, of course, integrated as one unit in most traditional cultures. So it's very difficult to separate those two. But by placing a focus on the scientific aspects in a science class, I feel that's very appropriate.
Yes, well, of course, it's appropriate, but isn't it sad that we have the head of the curriculum development in this country, Dr. Barry McGraw, I think his name was, I saw, that seems to be able to just make this decision that it's not really relevant and doesn't need to happen.
Yeah, I find that really upsetting. I don't know if he bothered to consult with anyone else on this or just sort of made the decision on his own. I don't know all the facts of the situation, so I try not to say too much, too many things that are negative about it, but it is very upsetting. And I would certainly hope that if we're able to provide this information to him, that they would seriously reconsider this based on the evidence. I think that's the really important part, is that he should base it on the evidence, and the evidence speaks overwhelming that traditional indigenous knowledge is extremely important and should be included in the curriculum, including the scientific disciplines.
Now, the study of astrology, there's a hell of a lot up there that determines a lot that goes on across the planet. I mean, the moon and the tides, for example.
Right. That's
just one example. But what are some of the other aspects of astronomy that's utilised in most everyday life? But I suppose particularly from an Aboriginal perspective, what have you found from an Aboriginal perspective, where there might be particular, seasons changing, particular fruit or access to a particular animal or type of food?
Right. Well, there's several examples of that. Of course, astronomy was a major foundation for most calendars. When a certain constellation or a certain, star cluster like the Pleiades, for example, or something like that was in the sky at a certain time of the year, or would rise or would set, that would indicate the start of a new season or the end of an old season. And of course, seasons range from, you have some Aboriginal groups that have 4 seasons, to some have as many as 12, especially up at the top end. Most of them were based on astronomy. Food economics, of course, if you look at the Burong people of the Mallee country in northwestern Victoria, when Lyra, which is a bright star in the constellation Vega, when that would set on the horizon, that was the time that the Mallee foal would lay their eggs, which reaches the food source. And of course, the emu in the sky is a good example from all across Australia. But from here near Sydney, there's the famous emu in the sky engraving, which aligns to the emu. The engraving aligns to the emu in the sky when emus were laying their eggs. So there's lots of examples of this, and there's also evidence, especially of Torres Strait Islanders using astronomy for navigation, as many other Polynesian cultures did as well. So there's quite a tremendous amount of information there, and there are just so many examples, and we're finding more and more and more as we continue to do our research.
And are there common, like which we refer to the emu in the sky here, and I hear the stories of it down the coast towards Victoria and places, and I think there's a similar story out there in the centre. My question is, are they sort of universal or right across this country in particular, that same story that with the same meaning, like the emu nesting and stuff like that? Does that apply across the country, do you know, or are there examples of this where particular signs of astrology do apply right across the country, regardless of the region where you are?
Right, there are a lot of the emu in the sky does apply, of course, not to every group, but to many groups all across the country. The Wajik people of Perth see the emu in the sky. They may see it in slightly different ways, but it's still the same pattern in the sky, and it still relates in many ways to, when emus lay their eggs or when they're nesting, things like that. You can see that from the top end down to South Australia, your area up in, Queensland down here. So, yeah, it is all across the country. You find some other interesting trends, like In most Aboriginal groups, not all, but most, the sun is represented as a female figure and the moon is male. And I did a lot of work looking at meteors, and I found that across almost all of Australia that meteors were always seen as rainbow serpents. So there's these interesting sort of correlations across the country, despite the extreme diversity of Aboriginal groups, that there were a lot of similarities when it came to things like the night sky.
Now, I mentioned a professor, as a doctor, but it's Professor Barry McGraw, who is the chairman of the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. He thinks it's it's religious and spiritual beliefs that are the reasons that it shouldn't be included in the science studies. And you've already mentioned that it's not really that's not the case at all. It's much more than that.
Right. It's extremely complex, and I think that demonstrates a necessity, a need to have more Indigenous studies and incorporated into the curriculum, because the top people don't quite understand how it works. How do they expect everybody else below, the students themselves, the teachers, the educators, how do they expect them to know about this? And by denying this knowledge, it just perpetuates stereotypes. And I think that does a serious disservice not only to Indigenous people, but to the students themselves and the greater population of Australia, Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
Most certainly. Now, Chris, is there anything particular that you would like to add before we look at how we can make this bring more pressure to bear on the powers that be? Let me make this point first. I find it rather striking that I'm talking to two people whose origins are the United States, with your concerns about the lack of valuing Aboriginal astronomy and Aboriginal medicines in relation to the subjects of science and education generally in this country, bearing in mind that there's a national reform of education taking place. So my point here is that I'm talking to two foreigners, and I just wonder, are there Australians, are there people in this country out there that, and you may name some, that do have a similar concern? And the reason I make this point is that a lot of my people have said for a long, long time, and still say it today, the interest is far greater from people overseas in relation to the struggles, the survival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, the plight of our people in this country. Just to make that point, do you know people in this country, Australians, that share similar concerns?
Yeah, definitely. There's your points are definitely, they ring true for me, what you've said. But the very fact that I was alerted to what's happening with the Australian science curriculum, that was brought to my attention by a man by the name of Sam Altman, who is the convener for the Bachelor of Community Management in Warrawara. And he's an Australian bloke, and he's very passionate about social justice issues. But there's people all over the place. I mean, the bridge walk in 2000, was it? I think testifies to there is a spirit there. But unfortunately, a lot of the times people in power may not reflect some of those things, so it can feel as if there is a minority of people concerned with justice in Australia. But you are right. There is a tendency to ignore the things in your own backyard. And I remember when I first came to Australia, when I was asked to teach in Indigenous studies by an Aboriginal lecturer, Terry Witters, I noticed when I was teaching the class that 90 out of 100 students in year one Indigenous studies were American. They had all come overseas to do the course because they were interested in the exotica. So, I think it's the same when Australians go to the States. They want to study Native Americans, but when they're home, they don't want to know, well, it's not as exciting. And it's the same for Americans. There's not a whole lot of focus on Native American culture when they're in the States. So it's not that the people from the States are all that different to Australians.
Right.
It's just human nature, I think. But as far as what people can do, I mean, people are already doing it in droves in Aboriginal communities everywhere. They're trying to create respect for their culture with their children. They're trying to have unity in their communities, and they're trying to speak with people who are in the education system and translate the value of their culture and knowledge. There's people everywhere that are already doing that. So there's not any new solution, so to speak, like that. But you don't have to have a PhD to be able to solve these issues. I mean, I have a PhD, but really, a PhD, a doctorate, is just one big storytelling exercise. You just sit down for a few years and you tell a really big story. And Aboriginal people are master storytellers. They're some of the best PhD minds there is. And just continue to tell stories, and thinking about this justice issue, think about stories that come to mind that you think are important, and share those stories so that other people can be inspired with that, and network together. But my own plan is to focus on this injustice, whether or not it's intentional, and try to think of as many stories as I can in my area of knowledge that I've been hearing, and put those together to share with the government and the public, so that it can be shown what's happening. But I mean, if on a level of that particular solution, if people want to contact me, if they want to collaborate in that story sharing exercise, I can give my email address if you like. But that's just
That'll be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My name, it's Chris, CHRIS .Kavelin, KAVELIN @gmail.com. I'll just give you the simple one so that you can get through to me. But if anybody has any stories about medicines that they know scientists have come in and researched, and I know everybody here has stories. Every Aboriginal person I've spoken to says, "Oh yeah, I know. There's some people came through our way a while ago," and it happens in every community, but the stories just don't get shared and told in the public, and so we don't appreciate how much scientific knowledge is being extracted from Indigenous communities, but not being honored, and we need to honor it. So I think that's the best solution.
It's a good point you make, the stories are told, stories are taken, stories are extracted, but they are not honoured.
That's right.
It's certainly a good point you make, yes, most certainly. All right, look, it's certainly great to have you on the program this morning with us, joining us, and you also made another good point there, that we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we must make more of a priority by honouring those stories and experiences and relating them on to our younger ones, to our own people.
That's the best solution.
Keep them alive, yeah. Look, my friend, thanks for joining us today. It's really good to have you with us, Chris. And
thank you, Sergeant. It's been a pleasure.
Let's hope we'll talk again sometime.
Thank you.
And you mentioned the names of a few friends there, Sam Altman and the other man there you just mentioned from out at Armidale way. Got you in to do
Terry Witters.
Terry Witters. Terry Witters is a long-time family friend, yeah. All right. You're in good company with those people. You're in good company.
Thank you.
You have a good day, and thanks for joining us. I'll now ask Duane. Duane, what are your thoughts? Are there ways that you would like to see people mobilise or connect with the powers that be to assist in to put some pressure on to recognise and value Indigenous knowledge systems?
Yes, I agree with what Chris said as well. I would encourage those who are non-Indigenous to really dive in and try to understand Aboriginal cultures, to really educate yourself, especially if the school system's not going to do it. The best way to do it is to do it yourself. So talk with Indigenous people, read, do as much stuff as you can to really gain a good understanding of this. I think that would be a good way for non-Indigenous people to really understand how it works. And some areas of science, may not seem all that interesting. Medicine certainly is, and I certainly think astronomy is. I found that's a really great way to help bridge the gap, because everybody's interested in astronomy. And I work at Sydney Observatory and give some tours there, and whenever I talk about Indigenous astronomy, there's always a lot of interest there. So I think it's one of the many ways that can help bridge the gap. So I would also encourage people to write to your ministers, write to the people in power who are controlling these things, and really provide the evidence they need to help convince them, to help them understand better. Because if we don't, nobody else will. So I think it's important that we all get together and really try to help push this using an evidence-based approach. I think would be best.
Very good, mate. Because at the end of the day, Duane, we're talking about trying to grow more knowledgeable people, develop a better, a more humane society. That's where the results will come through and show. We're trying to create a better place for all of us.
Exactly.
Yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Duane, thanks for your time with us today. We certainly appreciate your views and being able to articulate those on air. Thank you very much, and we may talk again.
Well, thanks for having me on.
You have a good day.
Cheers.
Okay, bye now. It's now time for Staying Strong. But our two guests, before we go into Staying Strong, our two guests were Duane Hamacher, a PhD candidate and studier in astronomy studies, and Chris Kavelin. And Chris was more a lecturer, a researcher, and an interest in medicine and healing